Good afternoon. Happy Sabbath to you all. Being human, it seems as though we are always in a hurry. Yet, when we really think about it, God has never been in a hurry. Let me give you a couple of examples here. God waited a very, very long time after Adam and Eve sinned in the garden before he called Abraham. God waited almost 3,000 additional years before sending Jesus to enter into the human history. Then Jesus came and he waited almost 30 years to begin his public ministry. Jesus waited to gather and teach the 12. Jesus also waited through his arrest and crucifixion rather than to call on the legions of angels at his disposal. The point is, brethren, from the beginning to the end of the book, we see the stories of God teaching his people patience. Abraham had to wait 25 years. Joseph waited somewhere between 15 to 25 years. Moses waited until 80 to begin his role as Israel's leader. Israel waited 40 years in the wilderness before they entered into the promised land. And again, brother, most of us struggle with this slow mustard seed nature of the way they, father and son, work. We get impatient. As we look forward to the coming fall festival season, beginning with the Feast of Trumpets, picturing Jesus' return, which we're all waiting for. It's the next thing that's going to happen in this great plan of God, and we're waiting for it. And so we began to wonder and we began to ask questions like, why is God taking so long to send Jesus back to the earth? I have titled this message, God is not in a hurry. So I want us to see some examples, and I'll also want us to consider some examples of lessons that God wants us to learn from waiting and being patient. So let's begin with Abraham and Sarah. Their story begins in Genesis 12 and verse 1. But we're not going to read there. That's just where their story begins. But we are going to begin reading in Genesis 16, verse 1. And we're going to read these first two verses, 1 and 2, from the NIV. Genesis 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed with Sarai, his wife. So Abraham's wife, we find very clearly, was stuck with waiting and growing impatient. What I mean by that is God had promised them children. In fact, he had promised them as many children as the stars of the heaven. You can read that in Genesis 15 and verse 5. Yet, time was ticking. Sarah was growing older, and she worried that she had not yet had any children. We know the story, but we don't know all the details. And so I word it as maybe she started thinking she had become invisible to God and it was time to take matters into her own hands. So she decided she would not wait any longer. And so she devised a plan to get what she wanted. And when you know the whole of the story, she got it all right. A pregnancy, yes, plus a whole lot of trouble. Now, I want us to understand that Sarai, I will also refer to as Sarah because her name was changed to that by God. Sarah had followed a common practice of her time by giving Hagar to Abraham to become a surrogate mother, yet her plan backfired. And you know the story. You know the story. Hagar did become pregnant and perhaps a little haughty. And now Sarah's thinking, and I'm putting words into her mouth because we don't have her words, but perhaps then with another person looking down her barrenness, Sarah was more miserable than before. And yet, the thing is, if she had only waited instead of manipulating the situation, it's easy for us to see this all these many years later that that's what happens. But we, as I stated before, we don't like waiting. And here's the lesson that we learn from this story. I mean, there are several, but the one I'm focusing on today. The lesson is if we can wait and not manipulate, God promises He is always at work for our good. Go with me to Romans 8 and verse 28. You probably all have this committed to memory. Romans 8:28. But we know that all things, did that say all things? All things work together for them to whom that to good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. All things, not some, not many, not most. It says all things. It's an all-inclusive statement. Now think about this topic. All things work together for good to them that love God, to those that he has called according to his purpose. Therefore, we need to realize even when the situation seems to be going the wrong way, we can trust that his way is best. Not sometimes, not most of the time, all the time. Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. Isaiah 55, verse 8. For my thoughts, God doing the speaking, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than is implied than your thoughts. So I think in just as one verse, we come to the conclusion very, very early in this sermon that God knows what he's doing, that God's in charge. And God is not in a hurry. Obviously, these verses highlight the superiority of God's wisdom and his plans, thereby encouraging trust in his divine guidance, that he knows what he's doing. So as a result of this, knowing this, we need to be prayerfully trusting and waiting. And yes, having stated this, I very clearly, I know and I understand this is easier said than done. Yet the point is, the lesson is, when we wait and when we see God's goodness comes to pass, what happens is we create a history with God. We create a wide range of faithful moments where we have seen God's faithfulness. We can trust him. We know he's in charge. And then having this as a foundation, obviously this is to be our foundation. So having this foundation, it builds our faith in him, so we know that we can trust him again and again and again, no matter what the timing or how long it takes. Go with me to Psalm 27, verse 14. Psalm 27, 14, NIV. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. Psalm 130, verse 5, again, NIV. I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits, and in his word I put my trust. I mean, we read these verses and we have to, they're good sounding words and we agree with them. Yet we also have to say, could these be my words? Do I wait on him? And do I put trust and hope in his word? Isaiah 30 and verse 18, we read this earlier, but this time I'm going to read it in the NIV. Yet the Lord longs to be gracious to you, therefore he will rise up to show you compassion. Because the Lord is a God of justice, blessed are all who wait for him. There's benefits from waiting on God instead of working it out ourselves. So I think a good question for us to ask at this particular time might be, so why does God seem to move so slowly? That reminds me and gets me to thinking about a sign, a plaque that I have seen. I know you've all seen it in some way or another, and it's worded in different ways. But anyway, Lord, make me patient. Make me to be patient and do it right now. So with this question that I asked, why does God seem to be always so slow? Let me try to answer the question this way. And I want us to think about this. Do we realize that perhaps for most of us, patience was one of the first lessons we had to learn in our childhood? I'll show you what I'm talking about. When we think about it, the child who does not learn to be patient is more than likely not to learn much of anything else. When we understand, and as parents, should be teaching our children and our grandchildren, helping, patience is the evidence of an inner strength. And when it is rightly understood, impatient people are weak. What I'm saying is, it takes patience. I'm talking about still as a child, as a little child. It takes patience to be able to learn to read, to spell, to write, to master the multiplication tables. And I know there are many people as adults have never done that yet. And the reason is because they're not impatient. They're too impatient to stick with it, to really understand it. Mathematics is one of the easiest things there is once you understand there is a pattern that God worked out. And we could go on and on about things that takes children a long time to learn. The most common Hebrew word for patient means to bear or to suffer. And it's interesting is because the second most common Hebrew word for patient, literally translated, it means to long spirit. And the sense of the word is patience or long suffering. And the thing is, the same is true in the Greek language. The most common Greek word means to suffer long. Therefore, the word patience actually means to suffer long, and the Hebrew, I mean, in the King James Version of the Bible, translate patience almost every time as long suffering. When we think about it, and I interject here again, thinking about children, it even takes patience to grow. And we all need to realize that God designed that maturity as a slow process, not as an instant experience. Share something about myself. And I am very glad that God worked it out that way, that arranged things that way. Because I can still remember the pain that I had in my legs and my back when I grew 6 or 7 inches one summer. One summer. It hurt all the time. Having patience gives us time to get acquainted to growing up, whether we're talking about physically or spiritually. That's why God doesn't give us all truth at one time. It's a matter of timing for us to grow up, to grow into it. And so please realize impatience is usually a mark of immaturity. Well, at least that's what James thought it was. It's what he says. Go with me to James 1 and verse 4. James 1 and verse 4. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If you're a parent, had children, whether you still have children, little or whether they're grown or whatever the situation is, when we have children, at least little children in a car with us, they tend to think we have arrived at the destination when we stopped at the first traffic light. They have to be taught. They have to be given time to grow in this maturity aspect. And then for many of us as adults, a short waiting period at the doctor's office is simply unbearable. And then I'm not even going to go into waiting on the computer. It starts this circling thing, and we go, yeah, don't want to wait this long, and we go right out of it. What is that showing us? How impatient we are. Or there's something wrong with the computer, but probably most of the time it's not. It's doing what it's supposed to do. So again, as adults, we share our own time of being impatient. And you know what I'm talking about. So we go back to Abraham and Sarah's story. They got tired of waiting for the promised son, so Abraham hurried up and took Hagar as a second wife, and she bore him Ishmael. And you know the story. You know the story of also of how Moses got impatient and killed a man, an Egyptian. We know that. We can read that. I'm not going to read it. It's Exodus 2, verse 11 through 15. You know this story. We also know, as a result of his being impatient, this required 40 years of working, following sheep in the pastures of Midian. We also know that in later years, Moses became impatient again when he was told to speak to the rock, and he struck the rock. And what happened as a result of that? He lost entry into the promised land. So there's a very powerful lesson in some of these things that I'm pointing out without even going into great detail, but the lesson just kind of screams at us. And that is, it's dangerous to be impatient. Now, please go with me to Psalm 32 and verse 9, and I'm only going to read the A part of the verse. Psalm 32, verse 9, do not be like the horse or as the mule. This is a warning. This is a warning to us. And this is a warning that we need. Because the mule is stubborn and has a tendency to hold back, while the horse is impulsive and wants to rush ahead. And we're told, don't be that way. I also very clearly understand personality difference may enter in here. However, or yet, at the same time, we all have the same problem. We get impatient. And the difficulty that we have to wait on God is a result of that problem. Part of the problem is we're inclined to walk by sight and not by faith, even though that's what we're told as believers, that we're told to walk by faith and not by sight. But we do the very opposite. We know this. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 5, 7, but we walk by faith and not by sight. And we have to stop in the context of this sermon and ask ourselves, do I? It's an either or. It's, are we walking by faith or are we walking by sight? And our tendency as humans is we walk by sight and not by faith. That takes patience. God assures us that he is busy on our behalf, yet we still want to see something happening. Okay, I'm waiting on you, God, but I want to see something here. That's not waiting on the Lord. That's not being patient. It's human nature. At the sea, Israel was sure God had deserted them and destruction was on its way. We know the story. Don't even have to go there and read it. But, you know, I can just imagine the Israelites saying things like, listen to that wind. See how dark it is. We're about to get destroyed. And yet the thing is, we see it after the fact. We understand, we know that God was working in both the wind and the darkness. They didn't. They got impatient. They got scared. Exodus 14 and verse 21. Exodus 14, 21. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And they got impatient. It's better that we'd died at the hands of the Egyptians than you know their story. I'm not saying that we would have been doing anything differently. I'm just saying it's recorded. It's there. Notice also what Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, what he stated toward the end of the book of Genesis, and this is Genesis 42, and I'm going to read one verse, verse 36. Genesis 42:36. And I'm going to read this out of the Amplified Bible. Joseph, their father, said to them, "You have bereaved me by causing loss of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin from me." Listen to this. All these things are against me. Jacob cried out, all these things are against me. All these things are working against me. However, when we know the story, in reality, what we learn is all these things were working for him. But he was impatient. God was too slow. But God is not in a hurry. So here, brother, let me ask a question. Do you, and I mean you, and I got to put my name there, do we believe God's delays are actually simply his denials? The human tendency to say is yes. Now, as a believer sitting in church, we kind of hard pressed to answer that yes. But human nature, we would go, yeah, I believe that his delaying is simply his denying. I hope we don't believe that, because they tend to be the means, to be the ways through which God uses to prepare us for something better. As we read earlier in Romans 8:28, we need to realize here, God is always at work for our good as his children, and he is working all things out at all times. We need to realize that God is always working things out, and he's doing it all the time. And he's doing it for us. I also want us to please realize this includes the things that puzzle us. Like, I don't understand what's going on. Well, as well as the things that make us uncomfortable. And we get puzzled and we get uncomfortable when we have to wait. And I think we would all agree with that if we would just be honest with ourselves, that that's a true statement. So let's come back to us as believers. Therefore, as a result of seeing this and having to, to honestly state that, yeah, that is where we are, what we need to understand is the only way, I can't come up with other ways, the only way that God can teach us patience is to prove us, to test us. And all these examples that we've looked at, it's exactly what God was doing. I also want us to recognize that we need to acknowledge the only way we can learn patience is to surrender our will to God's will and let God have his way. Only way we can learn it is through God testing us, trying us, proving us, And what we need to do is acknowledge the fact that the only way that we can learn it is to surrender our will to his will. Think about this. Remember, God can grow a mushroom overnight. Yet, he also takes many, many years to grow an oak tree or a giant sequoia. God is not in a hurry. Looking at some other examples, God took at least 13 years to get Joseph ready to be prime minister of Egypt. And you know how long, all the things that went on there, sold into slavery. I mean, you know that. And then, but God's working it out. God's working it out. God invested 80 years preparing Moses for 40 years of service. David was a youth. Most commentaries think that he was somewhere between 13 and 17 years of age when Samuel anointed him king of Israel. He wasn't even brought in because he was so young. Obviously, he can't be the king. And Samuel said, "Do you have any other kids, any other boys?" "Well, I got this ruddy little, you know, keeps the sheep out in the pasture. Go get him." David was a youth when Samuel anointed him king of Israel, and David had to experience a great deal of suffering before he finally ascended to that throne. And you know his story. And a point I want to make here is, brethren, we are richer. We are richer because of it, because out of those years of training and suffering came many of David's greatest psalms. Only we don't tend to think about it like that. I think we need to think about it like that. Jesus spent 30 human years getting ready for his 3.5 years of public ministry. Patiently obeying his Father's will as he carried out that ministry. John 2 and verse 4, John 2:4, Jesus said unto her, "Woman, what have I with you? My hour is not yet come." You know these stories. John 11, verse 9. Are there not 12 hours in the day? Jesus asked his impatient disciples. So, brethren, please, I want us to think about it, and I want us to realize God has his times as well as his purposes. And for us to miss his times is to delay his purposes. God has his time as well as his purposes, and to miss his times is to delay his purposes. And for most of us, waiting is not easy. And maybe the hardest place for us to wait is in those trials of suffering. I mean, when we really think about it, it's very clear God does not always explain the what or the why he is doing it the way he's doing it. So it is in those hours of suffering, whether it be ours or that of a loved one, that we need to remember the words of the Apostle Paul over in Hebrews. So let's go to Hebrews 2 and verse 12. Hebrews 2 and verse 12. And I'm going to read this from the New American Standard Bible. Hebrews 6, I don't know what I said. Hebrews 6 and verse 12. So that you will not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. In the NIV, it says that you will inherit the kingdom. Through faith and patience. How do we know we can be in the kingdom of God? Living by every word of God and doing it by faith and patience. So this is not just a simple little topic. This is something that is extremely valuable to us and important to us. Go with me to Hebrews, still the Apostle Paul's words, Hebrews 10 and verse 36, New American Standard Bible again, Hebrews 10 verse 6, for you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. Our knowing God the Father is near us and that he is working out his wonderful purposes. I mean, we've already read verses to show that's true. That ought to encourage us. And yet, however, at the same time, all too often we get impatient just the same. So we have to remember, God is not in a hurry. Hebrews, well, I'm not going to read that again. Hebrews 6:12. I was going to read it in NIV, but I do want to read it. We do not want you to become lazy, but to imitate those who are through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. And in other words, the kingdom. We need to ask ourselves, do I, put your name there, do I hate waiting? I mean, we live in a society that is a very fast-paced society expecting immediate gratification, and it is results-oriented. So we ask, does that describe me? Does that describe you? And I also want us to understand and think about it this way, why we may think it is normal life. It's interesting for us to notice that it is also very much a cultural thing. Because most cultures in the world, we're minority in thinking and living this way. Now, more of them are getting more in that way because they're wanting to become more and more Americanized because, well, that's where the wealth is and you got to be like them, so they're getting more and more that way, but they have a very different approach to time than many other societies who are not as bound to time as we are. And so what I also here want to interject and us understand is Jesus is not operating on American time. In fact, when Jesus said he is coming soon, he certainly did not mean as soon as Americans think of it. And we read the Bible, and as a result of it, he says, oh, he promised this. He's going to, well, and he hasn't happened yet. And we get impatient with God. And of course, our Western world, we have to acknowledge, we have to understand, has become very enormous And we've seen a whole lot of large progress or change because of our obsession and our emphasis on time. We're productive more so than so many others. And then at the same time, we also realize we are stressed out more than other cultures. And the reason is because of this push and pull, this pace to accomplish as much as possible in the shortest amount of time. Also, as a result, we have set ourselves up for greater frustration and disappointment that, than others. And the reason is because we expect immediate results and solutions, fulfillment, progress, answers. And if you look at it in the context of this sermon, that is dangerous. In fact, the most dangerous of all this, how this affects our relationship with God. What I'm saying is as a result, we tend to feel that we are so busy for time that we have no time for God, no time for a prayer life, no time for studying His Word, or simply for waiting on Him. That's why it's dangerous to think this way. We also expect immediate answers to prayer. And because all too often, usually, however you want to word it, that doesn't happen that way, we often conclude that prayer is pointless. Have I ever had people in the church tell me that? I have. Or it's a waste of time. It doesn't work, or God doesn't care. That's dangerous. And yet, the truth is, brethren, the truth is God is not bound to time as we are. And that's the big lesson from this message today, from this sermon. In Revelation 22, verse 13, it tells us Jesus is the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. He is above time and he exists beyond time as we know it. How can he be at both ends, of something? He holds eternity in his hands, and he is himself the possessor of eternity and the giver of eternal life. Psalm 16, verse 11, New American Standard. Psalm 16, verse 11. You will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forever. Colossians 1:17. Colossians 1:17. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist, or continue, or hold together. That's a mystery to us. And I mean more so to us as humans. And yet, it is a reality to God. And I am saying this is true because God is not in a hurry like we are. In his word, he tells us the reason it appears like a delay is simply an issue of perfect timing. Galatians 4 and we're going to read verses 4 and 5. Galatians 4, verse 4. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son. Hold it, wait a minute. When the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law. Now we can put in here all those verses that talks about that Jesus emptied himself and came down and took in the flesh and blood and bone human existence of a human being and all of that kind of stuff. But when the set time had fully come, when the time was right. You mean he had been preparing things before all of this? Yeah, he had been preparing things. He, Father and Son, they've been preparing things for this time. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, under the law, to redeem those born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Wow. Wow. So again, you could put Romans 8:20, all things work together. They're working things out for us. It took time, God's time, perfect timing. And then when Jesus finally did come as a flesh and blood and bone human being, he didn't even begin his public ministry until he was 30 years old. The point, once again, the reason was timing. Even his crucifixion and resurrection had its perfect time. He told his mother, Miriam, my hour has not yet come. He was waiting for the perfect time. John 7, verse 6, John 7, verse 6, NIV, my time is not yet here. For you, any time will do. Wow. Again, think about his earthly ministry. In John 21, verse 25, the Apostle John writes toward the end of the book, John 21, 25, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Jesus accomplished more in 3 to 3.5 years than many accomplished in 30. Yet, we don't read one time of Jesus being stressed out or in a hurry. He was working on God time, certainly not American time. I think that if we would, just think about this, maybe it's a little bit of a stress to put it this way, but if anyone had an excuse for being too busy for God, Jesus did. Now, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous to even make that statement, but I think we know what we're saying. And yet, what we do find him, what are we constantly finding him doing in most of his busyness? What do we find him doing most of that time? He was regularly separating himself from the crowds so that he could spend more time, not less time, with his heavenly Father. Jesus was never in a hurry or too busy. And I've had people tell me, baptized members in the body of Jesus Christ, I don't have time to get in prayer and Bible study every day. And now we think about it, and it's been over 2,000 years since he promised to come again and to right every wrong. In fact, in regards to Jesus' second coming and the salvation and the judgment that he is going to bring with him, notice what we have as a reminder from the Apostle Peter over in 2 Peter 3, verses 8 and 9. I'm going to read this from the NIV, 2 Peter 3, 8. But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. So it's obviously something we should pay attention to, right? With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. Okay, already our brain starts going tilt. We don't understand. We can't comprehend this. He's describing God time, not American time again. Verse 9, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. And still, instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. He is patient. His what seems as slowness is for us. And I also want us to understand and think about this. He has not yet returned, not because he does not care, but rather because he cares so much that he doesn't want any of us to perish. So he gives us time and space. And we see the pattern in a little child, how they get so impatient, but it takes time to grow, to mature, to learn to read, to learn to write, to learn the multiplication tables, all of those things. Brother, what seems like a long time for us is not to him. He has an entirely different relationship with time than we do. And I have two points here. One is God is never late, but always acts at just the right moment in just the right way. God is never late, but always acts at just the right moment in just the right way. And the second point here is God is also not stressed out like we are. So I think a good question to ask here is, so why do we get stressed out? Consider this. We get stressed out because we're impatient. And because we have a lack of trust in God. Now, that's hard for us to say. Well, of course I trust God. Really? Why are you so stressed out? Why are you so impatient? The answer is because we're impatient and we don't really trust God. So I'm bringing this to a conclusion. There's a whole lot more to this topic, but I'm going to bring it to a conclusion. So therefore, with what I have, we've read, we've looked at, we've stated, so brethren, as we wait for his coming, as we look forward to, we get to celebrate it year by year by year. The second coming, the Feast of Trumpets, which is the next thing on the horizon for us. So as we are waiting for the picture of the celebrating of, and then the actual coming, I'm going to ask that we will all ask God to do what is stated in Hebrews 4 and verse 16. Hebrews 4, verse 16. And I want to read this in a translation that I read on a regular basis, but I don't typically preach out of it. But this one worded in a way that I like. Hebrews 4:16 is from the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness and confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us at the proper time. In other words, at God's timing. So I end by asking, are we impatient with God, the fact that he is taking so long? Or are we waiting patiently for God to work things out according to God's perfect timing? The Aaronic blessing. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, speaking to Aaron and to his son, saying, on this wise you shall bless the children of Israel, saying unto them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And they shall put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. Brethren, we are so blessed. We are so blessed with the understanding that things are better when we trust God and his perfect timing. God is not in a hurry. Happy Sabbath. We love you all very much.